In the middle of a freezing New York blizzard, a battle-scarred veteran trudged through the snow, his loyal K-9 Ranger by his side. Suddenly, Ranger stopped, ears up, barking frantically. Ethan turned and froze. Under the dim light of an old bus stop, a little girl in a torn red dress sat curled up, barefoot, trembling, clutching a worn backpack. Her pale lips parted, her voice weak, fading. "Help! My mommy!" And then she went still. But what Ranger uncovered next would change everything Ethan thought he knew, and drag him into a secret buried deep beneath the snow. Snowfall blanketed New York beneath a silent, steel-gray sky, muffling the city's heartbeat into a cold whisper. Ethan Walker, 42, trudged through the icy streets, his worn boots sinking into slush as his loyal companion Ranger padded silently beside him. Ethan was a tall man with a rugged frame hardened by years of service in Iraq. His face bore the sharp edges of someone who had endured more than his share of storms. A square jaw shadowed with stubble, dark circles beneath deep-set hazel eyes, and lines carved into his weathered skin like battle scars. Once, his gaze had been sharp, alert, unbroken. Now, it carried the weight of exhaustion and quiet grief. Ethan was no stranger to loneliness. After his discharge from the army, life had slowly unraveled. He suffered from PTSD, relentless memories, the sudden tremors that came with explosions in his dreams, the cold sweats in the middle of silent nights. His marriage had collapsed under the strain, leaving him in a cramped rented room in the Bronx, stripped of family, stripped of pride, but clinging to one constant: Ranger. Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat and intelligent amber eyes, had served alongside Ethan during his final deployment. Broad-chested and powerful, Ranger bore a small scar along his right ear, a memory of a night ambush overseas. Unlike Ethan, Ranger had no doubts, no ghosts. Loyal, disciplined, yet instinctive, he was the one anchor keeping Ethan grounded, pulling him back every time the nightmares threatened to drown him. Together, they survived the long shifts of Ethan's warehouse job, the lonely dinners of reheated canned food, and the endless winter nights. The streets of the Bronx were nearly empty that evening. The city lights above sparkled against the falling snow, but down here, the world was bleak, dimly lit by dying street lamps and the occasional hum of distant traffic. Ethan adjusted the faded olive-green jacket he wore, its military patches frayed and dulled. His shift at the dockside warehouse had run late again, another 14 hours stacking crates and hauling steel, just enough to cover rent, kibble, and little else. He sighed, tightening the leash on Ranger, ready to disappear into the silence of his cheap apartment. Then Ranger stopped. The shepherd's ears pricked up sharply, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the frozen air. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Ethan paused, scanning the street, his instincts flaring awake like old embers rekindled. He crouched, lowering his voice. "What is it, boy?" Ranger tugged forward, leash taut, guiding Ethan down a narrow side street lined with chain-link fences frosted white. The snow crunched beneath their boots and paws. The wind howled harder here, pushing drifts into their path. Then, Ethan saw it. A dim yellow glow flickering ahead. An old bus stop, its cracked glass shelter coated in ice, stood half buried in snow near an abandoned convenience store. And beneath that shelter was a small figure. At first, Ethan thought his eyes deceived him. But as he drew closer, he saw a little girl, no older than 5, curled tightly on the cold metal bench. Her messy blonde hair was tangled beneath a torn red dress that barely reached her knees, her pale legs exposed and trembling. She wore no gloves, no boots, just faded socks damp from melting snow. A frayed, oversized coat hung awkwardly off her tiny shoulders, doing little to keep the cold away. Ethan's chest tightened. "Oh, God!" He knelt in front of her, careful not to startle the child, while Ranger sat close, ears flat, his amber gaze fixed protectively on her. Ethan reached out gently, brushing the frost from the bench with his glove before laying a hand lightly on her thin shoulder. Her skin was cold, frighteningly so. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth he no longer felt. "Hey, can you hear me? Where's your mom?" The girl stirred faintly, her small fingers clutching the strap of an old gray backpack pressed against her chest. Her lips were cracked, nearly blue, and when she opened her eyes, they were the softest gray, wide but dulled by exhaustion and hunger. "Mommy," she whispered, barely audible over the wind. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting down the rising panic. This girl had been out here for hours, maybe longer. He glanced around, scanning the quiet streets. No adults, no footsteps, only falling snow swallowing the world whole. He shrugged off his jacket in one swift motion and wrapped it tightly around her fragile frame. She resisted weakly at first, but soon melted into the warmth, her shaking lessening slightly as Ranger lowered his head beside her, letting her tiny fingers rest against his thick fur. Ethan hesitated, pulling out his phone. He considered dialing 911, but before he could, Ranger let out a sharp bark, ears twitching, body stiff. Ethan turned quickly, scanning the street behind them, and caught sight of something. A dark silhouette stood half hidden behind a street lamp far down the block, motionless, watching. Ethan's instinct screamed. He gripped Ranger's leash, his voice low and firm. "Stay alert, boy." The figure shifted, then disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving only empty streets behind. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't random. He didn't know why, but his gut told him this child wasn't just lost. Someone had been watching her. He glanced back down at the girl, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. Her breaths were shallow, uneven, and her eyelids drooped with exhaustion. He brushed a strand of hair from her frozen cheek, trying to keep her awake. "Hey, stay with me, okay? What's your name?" The little girl blinked weakly. "Lily?" "Lily," he repeated gently, giving Ranger's head a soft pat, grounding himself as much as her. "That's a beautiful name. Listen, Lily. I'm Ethan, and this is Ranger. We're gonna keep you safe, all right?" Her gray eyes moved sluggishly, following his voice. She parted her lips again, her voice breaking. Barely a whisper this time, laced with both fear and trust. "Help! My mommy!" Ethan froze. The words clung to the cold air, piercing him deeper than any bullet wound ever had. Before he could respond, Lily's fragile body sagged against him, slipping halfway into unconsciousness. Ranger whined softly, pressing close to her side, as if shielding her from the wind. Ethan wrapped his arms around the child, pulling her close, shielding her tiny body from the blizzard's relentless bite. "Hang on, kiddo," he muttered under his breath, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the shelter. Then, faintly, so faintly Ethan thought he imagined it, Lily's lips moved one last time, trembling with the weight of words she barely had the strength to speak. "Mommy said, you're the miracle." Ethan's breath caught, his heart pounding in his chest. Snowflakes danced around them in silent spirals, but for him, time had stopped. He stared at the little girl in his arms, the whisper still echoing inside his head, his grip on Ranger's leash tightening until his knuckles turned white. And somewhere deep within him, something long dormant stirred, a fragile ember of purpose, reignited in the frozen dark. The storm had grown harsher, the howling wind slicing through the narrow Bronx street as Ethan Walker held the small girl tighter against his chest, feeling the frailty of her tiny frame beneath his jacket. Her shallow breaths brushed against his collar, and her murmurs had quieted since she had whispered about her mother. Ranger stood alert beside them, his thick fur flecked with snow, his sharp amber eyes fixed on the empty stretch of road ahead. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound, his instincts heightened, as though he knew danger hid somewhere in the darkness. Ethan crouched lower, pulling Lily closer to shield her from the biting cold. "Hang in there, kiddo," he muttered softly, though it felt like he was reassuring himself as much as her. Then, from across the drifting snow, the hurried footsteps came. Ethan turned sharply, his body tense, his old military instincts waking like a flame in dry tinder. A figure emerged from the dim shadows of the alley, stumbling against the wind. As she came closer, the flickering streetlight revealed a young woman, pale and weary, clutching a paper bag pressed tightly to her chest, as though guarding her life inside it. She was thin, almost too thin, her frame fragile beneath a patched-up gray coat that was fraying at the seams. Her long, chestnut-brown hair clung damp to her cheeks, tangled by the wind, and her skin carried the pallor of exhaustion and hunger. This was Ava Bennett, 28 years old, Lily's mother. Her gray-green eyes darted wildly, glassy with panic, as she spotted Ethan holding her daughter. Without hesitation, she dropped the paper bag into the snow and sprinted the last few feet, her voice cracking through the freezing air. "Lily!" The little girl stirred faintly at the sound, but didn't respond. Ava's breathing hitched, and she reached instinctively to pull Lily from Ethan's arms. "It's okay," Ethan said quickly, raising his free hand in surrender, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I found her here. She was freezing. I just gave her my coat to keep her warm." But Ava wasn't convinced. She stepped back slightly, shielding Lily's tiny body against her chest, her expression fierce despite the trembling of her lips. "Why are you here? What do you want?" Before Ethan could answer, Ranger moved forward slowly, lowering his head and letting out a soft whine, as if sensing Ava's fear. The German shepherd extended his nose toward Lily's dangling hand, and after a pause, he licked her tiny fingers gently. Lily stirred, a faint smile touching her cracked lips, her gray eyes opening weakly to meet Ranger's. The tension in the air eased just slightly as Ava froze, watching her daughter's fragile fingers curl into Ranger's fur. She likes him," Ethan said quietly, nodding toward the dog. "And he likes her too." Ava swallowed hard, her breath shaking. For a moment, her suspicion softened, replaced by raw vulnerability. Her voice dropped, hoarse from exhaustion. "She was hungry. I went to the church down on Lexington Avenue. They give away food this late sometimes." She gestured faintly toward the paper bag she'd dropped in the snow, 2 dented cans of soup, half a loaf of bread, and a small packet of powdered milk. It was everything she had risked the cold for. Ethan glanced down at her thin coat, the frayed cuffs and mismatched buttons, then back at her pale, hollow cheeks. Ava looked like someone who had been fighting storms for far too long, someone too proud to ask for help, but too desperate to give up. "You can't stay out here," Ethan said, his tone firmer now, though his voice carried no judgment. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. I can take you there. You and Lily will be safe for the night." But Ava's expression hardened instantly, like a door slamming shut. She shook her head, her damp hair brushing her cheeks as the wind whipped harder. "No, we'll be fine. We always are." "A kid freezing at a bus stop isn't fine," Ethan countered, his frustration edging through. Her gaze snapped to his, steel hidden beneath exhaustion. "I don't want charity," she said sharply, her voice rising before she caught herself, then softening to a hoarse whisper. "Every time I've trusted someone, it cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. We'll manage." Ethan hesitated, the weight of her words hitting deeper than expected. He understood pride born from scars. He carried his own. "This isn't charity," he said quietly. "It's just someone helping when nobody else will." Ava's lips parted as though to reply, but then Lily stirred again in her arms, curling into the oversized jacket Ethan had wrapped around her. She glanced down at her daughter, sighing as if the fight had drained from her. For a fleeting second, Ethan thought she might agree. Then Ranger's growl rumbled low, deep in his chest. His body stiffened, ears pricking sharply toward the far end of the street. Ethan followed Ranger's gaze and saw it. A sleek black SUV parked beneath the broken street lamp, half hidden behind the swirl of falling snow. Inside, a figure sat still, the faint orange glow of a cigarette illuminating a sharp jawline before fading into darkness again. Ava's body went rigid instantly, her fingers tightening around Lily's small frame. Her gray-green eyes darkened, flickering with something sharp. Fear, not surprise. "You know them?" Ethan stated flatly, his military instincts rising to the surface. She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "I don't." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the denial. "It's just someone waiting for someone else." But Ranger didn't believe her, and neither did Ethan. The shepherd's fur bristled, his stance protective as a low, guttural snarl built in his throat. Ethan lowered his voice, steady but pointed. "Listen, if someone's after you, you need to tell me. I can help." Ava's gaze lingered on the SUV for a long moment before she finally turned back to him, her face pale beneath the streetlight. "You can't," she whispered, her voice tight with something heavier than fear. "Nobody can." Before Ethan could press further, the SUV's headlights flickered once, blinding in the swirling snow, then dimmed again as the engine roared softly before retreating slowly down the icy road until it vanished into the storm. Ava clutched Lily closer and turned away, her voice small and quiet as though she were speaking only to herself. "Thank you for keeping her warm." Ethan stepped forward. "At least let me walk you somewhere safer." She shook her head, whispering faintly, "We'll be okay. We have to be." Without waiting for another word, Ava carried Lily across the street and disappeared into the alleyways, her silhouette swallowed by the snow and shadows, leaving Ethan standing with Ranger beneath the flickering light. Ranger whined softly, his head tilting toward the darkened streets where Ava had vanished. Ethan knelt, rubbing his hand gently through Ranger's thick fur, his jaw tight as he stared down the path the SUV had taken. "Something's wrong," he muttered under his breath, his voice grim and certain. And in the cold silence of the Bronx, beneath the swirling storm, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The Bronx was drowning under another restless night of winter winds, but the streets near the small midtown community kitchen glimmered with faint pockets of warmth. Ethan Walker stood by the frosted glass doors, his breath forming short clouds in the air, while Ranger sat patiently at his side, his thick fur dusted with melting snowflakes. Since the night he found Lily under the bus stop, something inside Ethan had shifted. He couldn't explain why, but every evening after work, he found himself drawn to this place, the tiny kitchen where Ava volunteered in exchange for warm meals for her daughter. Inside, the air carried the comforting scent of simmering broth, stale bread, and faint spices. The kitchen was small but lively, buzzing with soft chatter and clattering dishes. The walls were faded green, lined with peeling posters about shelters, health clinics, and donation drives. Behind the serving counter, Ava Bennett moved with quiet precision, ladling steaming bowls of stew into chipped porcelain bowls. She wore a simple navy sweater under her worn gray coat and a borrowed apron, her long brown hair tied into a loose braid that brushed against her shoulder. There was a calm grace to the way she worked, efficient, focused, but Ethan could see the exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. Across the room, Lily sat on a short wooden bench near the wall, hugging her battered gray backpack, swinging her feet above the floor, her small frame wrapped in Ethan's jacket from the night they met. She looked healthier now, color returning to her pale cheeks, her gray eyes brighter whenever Ranger wandered near to nuzzle against her side. "Hey, soldier," called a warm voice from the back of the kitchen. Ethan turned to see Mrs. Dolores Grant, a plump woman in her late 50s with short curly black hair peppered with gray, standing behind a tray of bread rolls. She wore a patterned red scarf and thick-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose. Mrs. Grant had worked at the community kitchen for more than a decade, her cheerful demeanor softening even the hardest nights. "You gonna help or just stand there looking all broody again?" Ethan smirked faintly, scratching Ranger's neck. "I'm helping. This guy's on security detail." He nodded at the German shepherd, who tilted his head as though confirming the assignment. Mrs. Grant chuckled softly, shaking her head as she returned to slicing bread. Over the next hour, Ethan served alongside Ava, quietly handing out bowls of food to a line of weary men and women bundled in ragged coats, their faces worn by endless winters and bad luck. Ranger sat near the door, tail curled neatly around his paws, watching each person enter and leave with sharp, protective eyes. At one point, Ava glanced at Ethan between refilling trays. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said softly, her voice low enough to stay between them. Ethan shrugged, keeping his eyes on the ladle. "Maybe I want to." She hesitated, searching his face as though trying to gauge the weight behind his words, but before she could reply, Lily giggled from her bench when Ranger rested his big head on her lap. The little girl leaned forward and whispered into his ear like he understood every word, and perhaps he did. Ranger's tail thumped lightly against the floor. Later that night, when the kitchen closed and the crowd thinned, Ethan stepped outside into the narrow alley behind the building. The snow had stopped for now, leaving a brittle silence under the pale streetlight. Ava joined him, clutching a small thermos of tea between her chilled hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant rumble of traffic filled the space where words didn't fit. "You used to be in the army," Ava said finally, her voice quiet but certain. Ethan's jaw flexed. "Was it the haircut?" he asked dryly, though the faintest smile tugged at his lips. "No," she said, shaking her head, her gray-green eyes soft but steady. "It's the way you look at shadows, like you're always waiting for something to go wrong." He didn't reply right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his short dark hair, letting out a breath that fogged in the cold. "I served," he admitted finally. "Iraq. Years ago." She nodded, staring at the street as though weighing her next words. "That's why you don't ask questions, isn't it? Because you know sometimes answers hurt more than silence." Ethan looked at her sharply, but before he could respond, Ranger growled low in his throat, his body tense, amber eyes fixed down the alley's far end. Ethan followed his gaze. A man in a dark hooded coat stood partially hidden behind the shadow of a dumpster, motionless, just far enough that the dim light barely caught his face. The stranger was tall and lean, his posture coiled like someone used to moving quietly. Ethan stepped slightly forward, instinct burning through his veins, his voice clipped and firm. "You lost?" The figure didn't answer. Ranger rose, fur bristling along his back, a deep snarl building from his chest. The man turned suddenly, boots crunching against packed snow, and bolted toward the street. "Stay here," Ethan ordered Ava sharply, before sprinting forward, Ranger pulling hard against the leash as they chased the figure around the corner. But by the time they reached the street, the man had vanished into the chaos of flickering lights and freezing shadows. Ethan scanned the rooftops, the alleys, even the parked cars nearby. Nothing. When he returned, Ava stood stiffly by the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her pale knuckles dug into the sleeves of her coat as she asked, "Who was that?" "That's what I was hoping you'd tell me," Ethan said evenly, but her silence spoke louder than words. Her gaze shifted away, jaw clenched, and she shook her head. "I don't know." "Don't," Ethan said firmly, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "Don't lie to me. That wasn't random. He was following you. Or Lily. Or both." Ava swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, please, just leave it alone." Her answer only deepened his unease. That night, as Ava bundled Lily into her thin coat and walked away beneath the dim street lamps, Ethan watched them go, with Ranger sitting silent beside him, ears still twitching as if tracking invisible ghosts. He didn't know who the hooded man was or why he was watching, but Ethan's gut told him one thing with certainty. Something dangerous was unfolding, and Ava was right at the center of it. The night was quieter than usual, but Ethan Walker couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something had shifted since the hooded man vanished into the shadows behind the kitchen. The cold Bronx air stung against his face as he walked Ranger back to the modest block where Ava and Lily sometimes stayed. The German shepherd padded close at his side, tail low, ears twitching restlessly at every faint noise in the distance. Ranger had been unusually alert since the night before, reacting to sounds Ethan couldn't hear, smells Ethan couldn't detect. Ethan trusted his instincts. After all, they had survived worse together. The following evening, as the kitchen wound down, Ethan sat on a worn wooden bench near the back hall. Ranger stretched out at his feet. Lily approached him quietly, clutching her faded gray backpack, the straps fraying at the edges. Her small boots made soft crunches on the old tiles. She hesitated for a moment before sitting beside him, her tiny body leaning against his shoulder. Lily's cheeks were rosier these days, and her gray eyes a little brighter, but her movements carried the subtle weight of a child who had grown used to silence. She fiddled with the zipper of her backpack before pulling out a crumpled photograph, handing it to Ethan with both hands. "Mommy said, if anything happens," she whispered softly, her voice cracking slightly, "give this to the nice soldier." Ethan froze, staring down at the photo. It was creased, edges bent and smudged, but the image was clear enough. In it stood Ava, looking younger and healthier, holding a toddler Lily in her arms. Beside her was a tall man in a charcoal gray suit, sharp features, neatly combed dark hair, and a jaw set with authority. His hand rested lightly on Ava's shoulder. Behind them was the polished glass facade of a high-rise building, sunlight glinting off steel and mirrors. Ethan flipped the photo over, revealing a single handwritten address, Kane Tower, Manhattan. His gut twisted. The name meant nothing to him yet, but he knew instinctively this wasn't some random coincidence. That night, after walking Lily back to Ava, Ethan sat hunched over his aging laptop in his cramped rented room, Ranger resting his chin on his boots. Typing the address into an online search led him to a pristine corporate website, Kane Pharmaceuticals, headquartered in a luxury skyscraper downtown. The company's CEO was Jonathan Kane, a 45-year-old business magnate. The image of the man in the suit matched perfectly. Jonathan Cain's online profile showed him as the golden son of New York's elite, 6'2", strikingly handsome, a lean build that projected power rather than vanity. His sharp blue-gray eyes stared coldly out from photographs, framed by short dark hair streaked with faint silver at the temples. Press articles praised his intelligence and strategic brilliance, but Ethan noticed recurring undertones. Whispers about controversial clinical trials, lawsuits buried before they surfaced, and an extraordinary influence over local politicians. Cain was untouchable. Ethan leaned back in his chair, fingers rubbing at the back of his neck, his instincts buzzing. He'd seen men like Cain before in war zones, the ones who controlled lives from a distance, never getting blood on their hands, but always pulling the strings. The next day, Ethan stopped by the kitchen early, hoping to ask Ava directly about the photo. But when he arrived, Ava was different. Guarded, tense, her usual soft composure replaced with nervous energy. She avoided meeting his eyes, keeping busy scrubbing counters that didn't need cleaning. "Can we talk?" Ethan asked quietly, leaning against the doorway. "Not now," she murmured without turning around, her voice tight. "I'm busy." He frowned. "It's about Lily. About this." He carefully pulled the photograph from his jacket pocket, holding it up. For the briefest second, her hands froze, gripping the edge of the counter. Then, without a word, she turned, untied her apron, and walked toward the back door. "Ava!" he called after her, but she didn't look back. Ranger whined softly, pacing near Ethan's feet, sensing his frustration. Ava disappeared into the alley, and when she returned an hour later, Lily was already asleep, bundled in Ranger's old blanket near the bench. Ava stayed silent, her expression distant, refusing to acknowledge the photo or his questions. Over the following week, Ethan noticed patterns he couldn't ignore. Ava started rotating between different shelters, never staying in one place for more than a night or two. She skipped the kitchen entirely some evenings, only to show up late at night carrying Lily half asleep against her shoulder. Every time Ethan tried to ask, she brushed him off with brittle reassurances. "We're fine. Please just let it go." But Ethan couldn't. That Saturday, after finishing his shift at the warehouse, he decided to visit Cain Tower in person. Manhattan's glass and steel skyline glittered under the dim winter sun, an entirely different world from the crumbling corners of the Bronx. Cain Tower loomed 30 stories high, a polished monolith rising above Midtown, with security cameras glinting under the eaves. Ethan kept his jacket zipped, Ranger trotting closely by his side, and approached the front entrance disguised among the evening crowd. The lobby was spotless, designed in clean lines and muted tones, filled with the quiet murmur of wealthy professionals carrying leather briefcases and sipping coffee from paper cups. A uniformed guard at the security desk glanced at Ethan and Ranger briefly, his posture rigid but professional. Officer Mark Holloway, early 40s, was tall and solidly built, clean-shaven with neatly cropped blonde hair and a faint scar across his right eyebrow. He radiated the controlled confidence of someone who had served before, and his sharp blue eyes tracked every movement in the lobby. "Pets aren't allowed past this point," Holloway said evenly, though his voice lacked hostility. Ethan nodded politely. "Just here to ask a few questions about Jonathan Cain." That earned him a sharp look. Holloway's gaze hardened, his hands resting deliberately on the counter. "Then you'd better make an appointment like everyone else." Ethan studied him for a moment, recognizing the faint stiffness in his stance, the subtle telltale signs of someone trained for more than corporate security. He chose his words carefully. "Just thought you should know. There are people watching Ava Bennett and her daughter Lily." Holloway's composure cracked, just slightly, his jaw tightening, his eyes flickering briefly before regaining control. "You should leave," Holloway said curtly, lowering his voice so others couldn't hear. "For your sake. You don't want to get involved with Cain." Ethan's grip on Ranger's leash tightened. "Too late." Holloway didn't reply, but as Ethan turned to leave, he caught a faint murmur under the man's breath. Something about private security and orders. That night, back in the Bronx, Ethan found Ava and Lily sitting quietly near the steps outside the kitchen, the paper bag of food balanced on Ava's lap. He approached slowly, crouching near them, his voice low but steady. "You need to tell me the truth, Ava. Who is Jonathan Cain?" She finally looked at him then, her gray-green eyes clouded with exhaustion, fear, and something else. Resignation. "It's complicated," she whispered, her voice shaking faintly. "You make it sound like we're running out of time," Ethan said quietly. She lowered her gaze to Lily, brushing a stray lock of blonde hair from her forehead. "Because we are." The snowstorm swept through New York like a living thing, rattling street signs and carving swirls of white across the darkened skyline. Ethan Walker sat on the edge of his bed in his cramped Bronx apartment, the soft hum of the radiator barely keeping the cold at bay. Ranger lay stretched out on the worn rug, his ears twitching occasionally, as if sensing something unseen outside. Ethan rubbed his hands together, trying to drive away the gnawing unease that had been building for days since Ava's cryptic words. "Because we are." Then his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Stay away from Ava and the girl if you want to live." Ethan's jaw tightened, his chest burning with something halfway between dread and anger. He glanced down at Ranger, who had already risen to his feet, fur bristling. Amber eyes locked on him like he understood every word. Ethan clenched his fists, muttering under his breath, "Yeah, like hell I'm walking away." Less than an hour later, Ethan and Ranger were moving quietly through the icy streets near the docks. Ranger led the way, nose to the ground, tail stiff, his sharp instincts pulling Ethan towards something buried in the storm's silence. The closer they got, the stronger Ranger's pace became, until finally they stood before a long abandoned warehouse near the waterfront. The building's windows were shattered, its steel doors rusted from years of neglect. But Ethan spotted fresh tire tracks in the snow. Crouching low, he followed Ranger toward the side of the warehouse, where the faint glow of a running engine illuminated the storm. Parked beside the loading bay was a sleek black SUV, half hidden beneath the shadows, the same kind he had seen before. Ethan approached cautiously, hand resting on Ranger's back to steady him. He peered through the frost-coated window of the SUV and saw a black leather briefcase lying open on the back seat. Inside were files neatly stacked, illuminated faintly by the glow of a dashboard light. Ethan exhaled slowly, wiping a small patch of frost from the glass before slipping a gloved hand through the slightly cracked rear door. He pulled one folder free, flipping it open under the dim streetlight. What he read made his blood run cold. Project Helix, Subject L27. Attached beneath the title was Lily's photograph, alongside a detailed medical profile listing her name, age, and genetic markers. Ethan scanned the notes, his stomach churning. Experimental pediatric drug trials, immune response testing, and an identifier, priority alpha asset. Ranger growled low, sensing his rising tension. The sound of crunching snow made Ethan whip around instantly, files clutched tight in his hand. A figure emerged from behind a nearby shipping container, moving with the calculated precision of someone trained to remain unseen. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark tactical jacket, the lower half of his face obscured by a black scarf. His black hair was cut close, his stance rigid, his hands gloved. "Put the file back," the man ordered coldly, his voice deep but controlled. Ethan narrowed his eyes, sizing him up quickly. Military build, steady gait, left leg favoring slightly, likely an old injury. Whoever he wasn't some street thug. This was professional. "Not until you tell me why a little girl's face is on here," Ethan shot back, his voice flat, steady. The man didn't answer, only pulled back his coat slightly to reveal the holstered sidearm at his hip. "This isn't your fight, Walker. Walk away." Ethan froze at the sound of his name. His heartbeat slowed, muscles coiling as Ranger stepped forward, teeth bared in a silent snarl. "Who sent you?" Ethan demanded. The man's icy gaze flickered just briefly before his voice dropped low. "Kane wants her back. That's all you need to know." Jonathan Kane. Before Ethan could react, Ranger lunged forward with a sharp bark, breaking the tension. The man stepped back, his hand twitching toward his holster, but Ethan grabbed Ranger's collar, pulling him close before things escalated. The stranger hesitated, eyes darting between the open SUV and Ethan, then turned sharply and disappeared into the white haze of the storm without another word. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his breath visible in the freezing air. The name Kane echoed in his mind like a warning bell. Back at his apartment, Ethan spread the files across his small kitchen table, scanning page after page. Each document painted a picture far darker than he imagined. Kane Pharmaceuticals had been conducting unauthorized drug trials on vulnerable children, experiments designed to manipulate immune responses and accelerate recovery rates. Many of the subjects were undocumented, pulled from shelters and forgotten corners of the city, their disappearances never investigated. Lily was one of them. Ethan's chest tightened as realization hit. Ava hadn't just been running from poverty. She'd been running for Lily's life. Digging deeper, Ethan found a series of encrypted notes attached to the project logs. After some effort, he managed to decode fragments that revealed something worse. Kane had set a deadline. Lily's unique genetic markers matched something his researchers had been chasing for years, and if they didn't secure her soon, the window would close. A knock at his door jolted Ethan back into the present. Ranger barked once, standing guard as Ethan opened the door to find Mrs. Dolores Grant, the kitchen volunteer, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, her face pale beneath the porch light. "Ethan," she said softly, adjusting her glasses. "Ava hasn't been back to the kitchen since last night. I thought maybe she was with you." The air left his lungs in a cold rush. Ethan grabbed his jacket, sliding the files into his bag, and whistled for Ranger. Within an hour, he tracked Ava to a shuttered subway station 2 blocks from the kitchen. The underground tunnels were damp and dark, filled with echoes of dripping water and the faint hum of distant trains. Ava sat huddled against the wall, Lily cradled against her chest beneath Ethan's old jacket. Her face was drawn, her eyes swollen from tears she hadn't let fall in front of her daughter. "Ava," Ethan said softly, approaching slowly, "we need to talk." She shook her head immediately, her hand tightening protectively around Lily's small shoulder. "You shouldn't have come." "You need to tell me the truth," he pressed, lowering his voice so it carried no judgment, only urgency. He crouched in front of her, pulling one of the documents from his bag and placing it on the ground between them. Lily's photograph stared back at her. Her lips parted, trembling as she whispered, "You weren't supposed to find this." "Then help me understand," Ethan said gently. Ava's gaze darted between him and the sleeping child in her arms. Finally, her shoulders sagged, her breath shaky as she spoke. "Jonathan Kane is Lily's father." Her voice cracked on the words, but she forced herself to continue. "I didn't know what he was doing when I met him. By the time I found out, it was too late. He planned to use her, like all the other children." Ethan's jaw clenched, anger rising like a tide, but Ava's quiet desperation held him still. "I had to run," she whispered, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "I didn't care what happened to me, but I won't let them take her." Ethan placed a hand gently on Ranger's back, grounding himself in the weight of the choice before him. He looked Ava straight in the eyes, his voice steady but low. "Then they're going to have to go through me first." The night bled into silence, only broken by the crunch of boots on fresh snow and the low growl rumbling from Ranger's throat. The storm had passed, leaving the Bronx wrapped in an eerie stillness. But Ethan Walker's instincts screamed louder than the cold wind ever could. Something was coming. Ethan had barely processed Ava's confession when the message arrived, a warning delivered through absence rather than words. Lily's small backpack, the one she clutched like armor, lay abandoned in front of the kitchen steps. Ranger sniffed at it, his amber eyes alert, tail rigid, hackles raised. Then Ranger picked up a scent. Sharp, urgent, wrong. Without hesitation, the German Shepherd lunged forward, dragging Ethan by the leash toward an alley 3 blocks away, his nose low, weaving between trash cans and frozen puddles. Ethan followed, his boots sliding on ice, every muscle wound tight with panic. Somewhere ahead, a muffled cry broke through the night, high and fragile. "Lily!" Ranger darted around the corner, and Ethan turned just in time to see a black SUV idling at the curb, its doors open. 2 masked men were shoving Lily into the back seat. One was tall and lean, dressed in a tactical coat, his movements swift and precise. The other was shorter, broader, with a shaved head and tattoos snaking up his neck, his gloved hands gripping Lily's tiny arms. "Let her go!" Ethan roared, charging forward. The taller man spun, revealing sharp, angular features beneath his mask. His pale gray eyes narrowed, and without a word, he drew a suppressed pistol, firing a shot at Ethan's feet. Snow exploded upward. Ranger didn't hesitate. With a guttural bark, he lunged at the shorter man, knocking him backward into the snow. The larger man cursed, swinging an elbow at the German Shepherd, but Ranger sank his teeth deep into the attacker's forearm, tearing through fabric and muscle. The man screamed, dropping his hold on Lily. "Run, Lily!" Ethan shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind him. But the taller man stepped between them, moving with lethal grace. He threw a precise strike at Ethan's ribs, sending pain shooting up his side. Ethan staggered, but countered with a sharp elbow, landing a blow to the man's jaw. It barely slowed him. Before either could land another hit, a deep, commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" From the shadows emerged Jonathan Cain himself. Dressed in a long charcoal coat over a black cashmere suit, his tall frame and cold composure made him look less like a man and more like a verdict. His dark hair was slicked neatly, faint streaks of silver framing his sharp jawline, and his steel-gray eyes held the kind of power that could silence storms. He walked with deliberate calm, hands tucked into leather gloves, as though he were untouchable here among the snow and blood. Ranger snarled, limping slightly but planting himself firmly between Lily and Cain. Ethan's chest heaved as he straightened, fists clenched. "You're not taking her!" Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You still think you understand what this is about, Walker?" "I know enough," Ethan shot back. Cain's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Do you?" He gestured to the SUV, where the masked driver kept the engine running, silent and watchful. Then his voice lowered, edged with venom. "You think you're the hero in this story, but the truth, Walker, is you're the reason it even exists." Ethan frowned, muscles coiled. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jonathan slipped a folded file from inside his coat and tossed it into the snow at Ethan's feet. "Read it. That's your signature." Ethan's breath caught as he unfolded the damp pages. It was an old military contract, stamped and dated from his deployment in Iraq, his own name at the bottom. He scanned the details, bile rising in his throat. Years ago, Ethan had authorized a shipment of humanitarian aid crates meant for civilians in conflict zones, but the documents in his hands revealed the truth. Those shipments were weapons, secretly supplied by Cain Pharmaceuticals under a subsidiary front. "You moved my weapons," Cain said softly, his voice like ice sliding under skin. "You delivered them into a city I needed destabilized. Do you remember Al-Rafid?" Ethan's chest constricted painfully. Memories slammed into him. The dusty streets, the sound of distant mortars, the hospital reduced to rubble. And the children. So many children. Cain stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Those weapons were mine, Walker. And do you know what came after? A test site. For my drugs. The survivors, the children left broken and sick. They became my subjects." Ethan's vision blurred, his grip crushing the papers in his hands. "You son of a—" "You signed the order," Cain interrupted coldly, his gray eyes locking on Ethan's. "You set this into motion. Every scream, every scar, they exist because of you." For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. His knees nearly buckled beneath the weight of it, guilt crashing into him like an avalanche. He staggered back a step, dropping the papers into the snow, his chest heaving with silent horror. Behind him, Lily's tiny voice broke the suffocating silence. She tugged at his sleeve, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Uncle Ethan," she whispered shakily, her small arms wrapping around his waist. "You're still my hero." Her words shattered something inside him, the wall of shame, the endless loop of memories, the crushing belief that he didn't deserve redemption. He closed his eyes briefly, pressing his hand to her back, grounding himself in her warmth, her trust. When he opened them again, the guilt was still there, but it burned differently now, like fuel instead of chains. Jonathan watched him silently, studying the shift in his expression. "Walk away," he warned, his voice calm but edged with threat. "I'll find her, Walker, with you or without you." Ethan stepped forward, standing between Cain and Lily, Ranger limping to his side, blood matting the fur on his right shoulder, but still snarling with unyielding defiance. "You'll have to go through us," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, unshaken. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his sharp features hardening into something colder than the storm around them. He gave a curt nod to his masked men, then turned back toward the SUV. "This isn't over," he said flatly, before disappearing into the swirling snow. Ethan dropped to one knee beside Ranger, gently pressing a hand against the wound on his shoulder. The shepherd winced but licked Ethan's wrist in quiet reassurance, as if telling him he was still ready. Snow fell softly around them, mixing with blood and silence. Ethan stared at the empty street where Kane's SUV vanished, his jaw set with a quiet, dangerous resolve. He wasn't running anymore. The city was quiet after the storm. The streets coated in layers of fresh white snow that muffled the sounds of New York's restless pulse. Ethan Walker stood in the lobby of the FBI headquarters downtown, his rugged figure reflected faintly against the glass walls as he handed over the final stack of documents. Ranger sat obediently at his feet, his thick black and tan fur still matted from the healing wound on his shoulder. Across from him, Detective Carla Hayes flipped through the files one last time. Her sharp green eyes scanned the evidence before she looked up, nodding with quiet respect. "You've done more than you realize, Walker," she said softly, her short black bob brushing against her cheeks as she leaned forward. "These documents don't just implicate Jonathan Kane, they expose his entire network." Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "Just make sure no one else has to go through what Ava and Lily did." Within hours, the FBI and NYPD launched a coordinated raid on Kane Tower. Helicopters roared above the city as armored trucks blocked intersections and federal agents stormed through the glittering glass doors. Kane's private security force surrendered almost instantly. Jonathan Kane himself was led out in a charcoal gray suit, wrists in steel cuffs, his cold gray eyes unreadable but burning with silent rage. For the first time in his empire's reign, his untouchable fortress had fallen. News outlets exploded overnight, uncovering illegal trials, falsified medical records, and years of corruption buried under bribes and intimidation. Kane Pharmaceuticals was frozen, its board dissolved, its laboratory sealed. Ethan stood on the opposite side of the street, Ranger pressed against his leg, watching Kane enter the black federal vehicle. Kane turned briefly, locking eyes with him. There was no smirk this time, no parting threat, only silence. 2 weeks later, life began to settle. Ethan met Ava outside the community kitchen where it all began. The old red brick walls were dusted with snow, the scent of fresh bread floating faintly from inside. Ava looked different now, the constant tension in her shoulders replaced with a quiet exhaustion, her gray-green eyes softer as she watched Lily laughing with Ranger nearby, throwing small chunks of snow for him to chase. Ava turned to Ethan, fingers curled around a steaming paper cup of tea. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You fought for her long before I showed up. I just stood in the way when they came." She hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment before she whispered, "I didn't trust you at first." "I wouldn't have trusted me either," Ethan replied with a faint, tired smile. That made her laugh softly, the sound fragile but real, the first Ethan had heard from her since the storm began. 3 months later, everything changed. With Kane's conviction, the government awarded Ethan a compensation grant for exposing the pharmaceutical network, while a Veterans Foundation provided further support to help him rebuild his life. Ethan used the funds to move Ava, Lily, and Ranger into a modest 2-story house on the edge of Maplewood Park. The house wasn't grand, but it was theirs. White siding, wide windows, a little wooden porch overlooking the snowy park. Inside, the warmth of soft amber lamps replaced the chill of nights spent in shelters and alleys. Ranger claimed a corner of the living room as his domain, his tail thumping lazily against the rug as he watched Lily spread her crayons across the coffee table. With part of the grant, Ava opened her own small cafe called Lily's Table. It was tucked into a quiet corner of the neighborhood, its windows glowing with golden light every evening, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread, homemade soups, and cinnamon tea. Locals came not just for the food, but for the kindness behind the counter. Ava's soft laugh, Lily's bright smile greeting customers at the door, and Ranger lying by the window like the cafe's silent guardian. Ethan, meanwhile, took a part-time job as a security officer at a nearby Veterans Outreach Center. On weekends, he volunteered to help other displaced soldiers find housing and work, using his own story to remind them there was still a way back from the dark. One evening, the 4 of them gathered in the living room as a light snow fell outside, blanketing the park in white. Lily sat cross-legged on the carpet, clumsily braiding Ranger's fur as he lay still and patient beneath her small hands. Ava sat on the sofa, flipping through handwritten menu notes for the cafe, while Ethan leaned against the windowsill, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. For the first time in years, there was no chase, no fear, no shadows creeping closer. Ava looked up at him, her soft voice breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it? Getting involved? Putting yourself in danger? For us?" Ethan sipped his coffee, his gaze on Lily as she giggled when Ranger rolled onto his back, pawing at the air. "Not once," he said simply. Ava's lips curved into a small, quiet smile, her gray-green eyes shimmering faintly in the golden light. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless, blanketing the world in silence. Ethan set his mug aside and walked over to join Ava on the sofa, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder as Lily climbed up beside them, Ranger curling up at their feet. Together, the four of them sat before the window, watching the snow fall. No running, no secrets, no fear, just warmth. Just home. And for the first time, Ethan finally believed it. They had found the peace they had been searching for all along. Sometimes, miracles don't come as lightning in the sky or voices from heaven. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, through people who choose kindness when the world turns cold. Ethan thought he was saving a little girl, but maybe God sent Lily to save him too. In their darkest winter, he gave them warmth, a home, and a second chance at life. And maybe that's what life really is. Tiny, quiet miracles hidden in the chaos of our everyday struggles. You never know. You might be someone's miracle today. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to leave a comment below and share where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to join our growing family, and may God bless you and your loved ones with peace, hope, and strength. Sometimes, the biggest miracles begin with the smallest acts of love.